A group of 45 B-29 bombers
March 9th,
take off towards the Japanese mainland.
1945. Just before midnight, a lone Japanese fighter climbed into the cold darkness above Tokyo Bay. Below him, the capital slept. Ahead of him, an approaching wall of engines shook the night sky. More than 300 American Superfortress bombers crossing the coastline in a low-altitude strike, unlike anything Japan had ever seen. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura believed he was racing toward another desperate interception. Instead, he was about to uncover the secret that doomed Japan's air defense, an American weapons system so advanced that no Japanese pilot could overcome it. Before we begin, subscribe for more No Man's Land history. March 9th, 1945, began like countless other nights during the final months of the war. Sirens, scattered reports of incoming aircraft, and exhausted ground crews scrambling under dim lantern light. But there was something different in the way officers whispered in the operations hut at Narimas Airfield. Radar stations along the southern coastline were tracking the largest formation of enemy aircraft ever seen approaching the capital. And more puzzling than the sheer size of the formation was the altitude. Instead of the usual towering approach from the edge of the stratosphere, the American bombers were flying low, dangerously low, barely 7,000 feet above the ocean. For Japan's remaining fighter squadrons, this was both an opportunity and a warning. The massive Superfortress bombers were nearly impossible to reach at their normal attack altitude, but flying low meant they were within the performance range of even Japan's failing aircraft. Yet air defense officers had no explanation. Why would the Americans abandon the altitude advantage that kept them safe from interception? The question hung over the airfield like a ghost no one dared mention. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, one of the last fully trained veterans in his unit, climbed into his Hayate fighter with the weight of that mystery pressing on him. The cockpit smelled of oil and cold metal. The gauges jittered from worn wiring. The engine beneath him coughed sharply before settling into an uneasy idle. It had been months since he'd flown a mission without worrying the engine would fail before the fight began. Tonight was no different. Ground crews waved him forward as officers shouted last-second updates. The formation was enormous, stretching for miles. The estimated number of bombers was over 300. The attack vector suggested they were heading directly for Tokyo. Hiroshi tightened his straps and taxied onto the blacked-out runway. He could feel the vibrations of other dying engines struggling to start around him. As he lifted off into the night sky, the first thing he noticed was the strange glow on the horizon, a faint reflection of moonlight against hundreds of approaching aircraft. Even from miles away, the low hum of their engines sounded like distant thunder. Hiroshi climbed toward the threat, unaware that he was flying into the single most devastating raid of the war, and toward a discovery that would explain why Japan's fighter forces had been dying faster than they could be replaced. Long before Lieutenant Hiroshi saw the bombers with his own eyes, Japanese air commanders had already learned to fear the silhouette of the American heavy bomber that now filled the southern sky. The B-29 Superfortress wasn't just another aircraft. It was the embodiment of an industrial machine Japan could neither outrun nor outbuild. Every pilot who had ever faced one understood the same chilling truth. The B-29 represented a leap in aviation engineering so extreme that it felt almost unfair, like something pulled from a future Japan had no way to reach. Its numbers alone told a story Japan didn't want to believe. The bomber could fly faster than many Japanese interceptors on bad fuel. It could soar above 30,000 feet, a ceiling that turned most Japanese fighters into wheezing, underpowered targets. It carried a bomb load heavy enough to wipe out entire districts in a single pass. But none of these advantages frightened Japanese pilots the most. The real nightmare, the one no training manual had prepared them for, was the bomber's defensive system. Earlier, American bombers depended on isolated gunners crammed into exposed turrets, shivering in the cold, thin air, while manually tracking targets. Pilots like Hiroshi had learned the weaknesses of those aircraft through bitter experience. Slip into a blind spot, attack from certain angles, and you stood a fighting chance. But the B-29 was different, and the reports coming back from surviving Japanese pilots were impossible to reconcile with the older patterns of air combat. They spoke of defensive fire coming from angles no human gunner could possibly track simultaneously. They spoke of turrets that reacted faster than a fighter could roll or climb. They spoke of being hit before they were even close enough to fire a single burst. Engineers insisted this must be exaggeration, born from fear. Commanders accused pilots of misjudging distances or losing nerve. Some suggested the B-29 gunners were simply better trained. But the veterans, the ones who had seen the tracer streams curving impossibly toward them, knew something deeper was happening. Tonight, as Hiroshi climbed toward 7,000 feet, he carried those scattered reports with him. Each one hinted at a terrifying possibility. The Americans had created a bomber that could see farther, react faster, and coordinate more perfectly than any human crew. And if that was true, then the old rules of interception no longer applied. The air war over Japan wasn't simply turning against them. It had already been lost, and no one had admitted it yet. The aircraft beneath Lieutenant Hiroshi that night, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, was supposed to be Japan's answer to the fast, high-flying American threat. In training manuals, it was praised as the Imperial Army's finest creation, fast, powerful, and deadly enough to stand toe-to-toe with the Mustang. On paper, the Hayate could climb past 34,000 feet, hit nearly 400 miles per hour, and throw a wall of fire with its twin cannons and heavy machine guns. Japanese engineers called it the Gale. Pilots called it the one machine that gave them a fighting chance. But by 1945, the Hayate existed in two versions, the one the engineers had envisioned and the one pilots actually flew. The latter was a compromised, exhausted aircraft, built in factories running on fumes. Every Hayate rolling onto the runway carried the same silent flaws: low-grade fuel that made engines detonate, replacement parts scavenged from wrecks, and airframes pushed far past their intended lifespan. A Ki-84 was only as good as its engine, and most engines no longer performed anywhere close to factory specifications. Hiroshi understood this better than anyone. He'd flown the Hayate in its prime, back when its engine roared clean and strong, back when it could climb hard enough to intercept high-altitude targets. Tonight, his aircraft shuddered at full throttle, coughing as impurities in the fuel robbed it of precious horsepower. The gauges vibrated, giving readings he no longer trusted. The plane still flew, but it felt tired, as if it knew the war was slipping away. His squadron, the 47th Sentai, had once been one of Japan's elite interceptor units. At its peak, it fielded 3 full companies of fighters, each flown by seasoned pilots who'd survived years of brutal combat. Now, the unit was a ghost of what it had been. Aircraft were grounded from lack of spare tires. Engines were rebuilt by mechanics who had never seen a proper training course. New pilots arrived with barely 10 hours of flight time, rushed into combat because there was simply no alternative. None of this changed the expectations placed on them. Whenever the bombers came, and they came almost nightly now, the 47th was ordered into the air. It didn't matter if their fuel tanks were half filled, if their weapons jammed under stress, or if their landing strips were cratered from previous raids. Intercept. Always intercept. Tonight, Hiroshi flew knowing his aircraft was one of only 8 Hayates still airworthy. Every one of those planes represented the last thread of Japan's hope to defend its capital. And as he climbed into the darkness, listening to the hum of an engine running on borrowed time, he understood the brutal truth. Even at its best, the Hayate had been designed to fight yesterday's war. The machine beneath him was valiant, but hopelessly outmatched by the steel monsters approaching from the south. By the time Lieutenant Hiroshi leveled off at 8,000 feet, the night sky over Tokyo Bay had begun to change. At first, it was only a faint shimmer, light where no stars should be. Then the shapes emerged, enormous, deliberate shadows sliding across the darkness in perfect formation. Hiroshi had seen B-29s before, but never this low, never this many, and never in a formation so staggeringly large that it seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. He steadied his breathing and wiped condensation from his gun sight. Ground control's last transmission echoed in his headset. 300 bombers inbound. It sounded impossible, yet the evidence filled the sky ahead of him. The moonlight caught the bombers' wings just enough to reveal their unnatural size. 4 giant engines glowing with a steady orange burn, propellers slicing the cold night air with mechanical precision. Hiroshi pushed his Hayate forward another few hundred yards. The scale of the American strike force hit him all at once. It wasn't just a raid, it was an airborne armada. The bombers flew so low he could see the ripple of prop wash over the water below, a shimmering distortion that followed the formation like a ghost. The normal B-29 altitude was 30,000 feet. So high, Japanese fighters often couldn't get close enough to attack. But tonight, the Americans had abandoned that safety. They were coming in at 7,000 feet, close enough for every fighter in the Tokyo region to reach them. For a moment, Hiroshi felt something he hadn't felt since 1943. Hope. A low-flying B-29 was vulnerable. Its gunners had less time to react, and its engines were within striking distance. Japanese pilots had been begging for this opportunity for months. Tonight, they finally had it. But the moment quickly soured as he drew near enough to recognize the bomb racks glowing beneath the fuselages. These weren't high-explosive bombs meant for industrial targets or military bases. They were incendiaries, the kind designed to ignite entire neighborhoods, consuming cities in walls of flame. And at this altitude, the Americans weren't dropping bombs. They were about to unleash a firestorm. Hiroshi's engine rumbled as he banked hard, aligning himself for the standard head-on intercept. His heart pounded, but his mind was focused. He had memorized the attack pattern. Position above the formation, roll inverted, dive through the lead bomber's flight path, fire, then break away before the guns could lock on. As he lined up the attack, another disturbing detail came into view. B-29s moved with eerie stability, as if carved from steel rather than built from aluminum. There was no weaving, no corrections, no signs of pilot fatigue. They looked less like aircraft and more like moving fortresses, advancing with the slow, unstoppable certainty of fate itself. Hiroshi tightened his harness, exhaled, and began his dive. The giants were within reach, but he had no idea the sky he was diving into was already watching him, calculating him, preparing to strike back with a kind of precision no Japanese pilot had ever faced before. Hiroshi inverted his Hayate and dropped into a controlled dive, the bomber at the center of his gun sight growing larger with every heartbeat. This attack profile, closing head-on, was the only tactic Japanese pilots believed offered even a sliver of success. Every manual said the same thing: aim for the cockpit, disrupt the bomber's command crew, and force the formation to break. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to climb away. If not, at least you died doing something that mattered. But as Hiroshi committed to his dive, something felt wrong. The B-29s weren't reacting like the B-17 and B-24s he had fought earlier in the war. There were no frantic gunners firing sporadic bursts, no blind spots to slip through, no moment of hesitation from the bomber crews. Instead, the formation moved with a terrifying calm, as if the aircraft were waiting for him. At 800 yards, still outside his optimal firing range, Hiroshi squeezed the trigger. His cannons thundered, streaking white-hot tracers toward the bomber's nose. For an instant he believed he might score a hit. Then the night exploded around him. It didn't come from the tail. It didn't come from the waist. It came from everywhere. A lattice of tracers arced toward him from multiple angles: top, bottom, front, and both sides, intersecting in a pattern so perfectly timed it felt inhuman. His aircraft lurched as rounds slammed into his fuselage. A fuel line rattled violently. Warning lights flickered. Hiroshi yanked the stick left, pulling 6 Gs, but the fire followed his movement with uncanny precision. No human gunner could track a maneuver that quickly. 3 seconds. That was the total time he spent inside the B-29's defensive envelope, and in those 3 seconds, he took more fire than he had in entire missions earlier in the war. Hiroshi recovered altitude and banked wide, gasping as he steadied the trembling Hayate. Ahead of him, another Japanese fighter, a Ki-61, attempted the same attack pattern Hiroshi watched in horror, as every turret in the lead bomber formation swiveled toward the approaching aircraft. A second later, converging tracers stitched across the fighter's nose. The Ki-61 vanished in a burst of flame. The realization hit Hiroshi so violently, he felt it in his chest. The Americans weren't aiming their guns individually. Their fire was synchronized, too fast, too coordinated, too mathematically perfect. This wasn't defensive gunnery. This was a machine, calculating, correcting, predicting. Hiroshi tightened his grip on the controls, heart pounding as the truth sank in. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber. It was the first warplane defended by a brain. As Hiroshi climbed back to 10,000 feet, trying to catch his breath and steady the shuddering Hayate, he replayed the attack in his mind. No matter how he examined it, nothing fit the pattern of normal bomber defense. Human gunners simply didn't react that quickly. Not in the cold, not at night, and certainly not across multiple turrets at once. The B-29's response had felt coordinated, unified, almost anticipatory. It was as if the bomber had seen the attack coming long before Hiroshi committed to his dive. And then the truth surfaced, a memory from a pre-war intelligence lecture he had nearly forgotten. American engineers were experimenting with remote turrets. At the time, it sounded absurd. Guns aimed electronically from inside a pressurized cabin, guided by some kind of calculating mechanism. No one in the room believed it. Japan's own aircraft used manually cranked defenses designed decades earlier. The idea of a gunner sitting comfortably inside the fuselage, controlling weapons mounted 20 feet away, seemed like science fiction. Now, staring at the B-29 formation gliding across the night sky, Hiroshi realized that fiction had become reality. The Americans had not only removed their gunners from the exposed turrets, they had created a centralized brain to aim the guns for them. Inside each bomber sat a complex network of analog computers, mechanical minds built from spinning gears, vacuum tubes, cams, and electrical relays. Each gunner didn't just fire one turret. He could command multiple stations at once. And when one sighting system locked onto a target, the others instantly updated, tracking the fighter as a single unit. This explained the impossible. This explained everything. The speed, the precision, the fact that every turret reacted in perfect unison. Where Japanese defenses were fragmented, each gunner acting independently, the B-29 formed a single organism, a bomber with a coordinated nervous system, a machine that turned 4 turrets and 10 heavy guns into a unified weapon. Hiroshi banked right, watching another wave of Japanese fighters rise from the coast. He wanted to warn them, to tell them the old tactics were suicide now. But communication was jammed with frantic chatter. Most pilots thought the bombers were simply flying with elite gunners tonight. None understood that they were flying into a weaponized calculation engine. Below, Tokyo burned brighter with each passing minute, the firestorm expanding in red and orange sheets. Smoke climbed thousands of feet, staining the sky beneath the bombers' wings. The city was becoming an inferno, and yet the superfortresses kept coming, line after line of silent, unstoppable giants. Hiroshi tightened his harness, swallowing the dryness in his throat. Japan's fighters weren't losing because the bombers were too big. They weren't losing because the pilots were afraid. They were losing because the Americans had moved into a new era of warfare, one where machines did the thinking, the tracking, and the killing. And Japan had nothing even close. For the first time in his life, as the glow of the burning capital touched the underside of his wings, Lieutenant Hiroshi understood that he wasn't fighting pilots anymore. He was fighting an invention. Smoke from the burning city rose like a second horizon, reflecting off the aluminum skin of the passing bombers. Hiroshi wiped sweat from his forehead, steadied his breathing, and pushed his Ki 84 into a long, curving descent. He needed a new angle, anything to avoid another suicidal head-on run. Reports from surviving pilots claimed the B-29's lower rear quadrant had less turret coverage. If there was a weakness, even a sliver of one, it would be there. He dropped below the formation, leveling out until the superfortresses loomed above him like drifting steel islands. From this position, he could see their bomb bay doors still open after releasing streams of incendiaries. The glow of Tokyo's flames cast an eerie underlight across their bellies, turning every aircraft into a dark cathedral floating on a sea of fire. It was surreal, almost beautiful, until the reality of what those flames meant forced itself back into his mind. Hiroshi nosed upward, climbing hard. His engine protested, coughing as impurities in the fuel robbed it of power. At 300 yards, he aligned the crosshairs with the belly of the trailing bomber. This time, his timing was perfect. Its lower turret was pointed off-angle, busy chasing another fighter. He fired. Explosive flashes danced across the B-29's underside. Metal fragments spun off, glittering in the glow of the inferno below. For a heartbeat, he believed he had done the impossible. He had hurt one. Then, the turret found him. It rotated toward his fighter with a speed that felt unnatural, as if someone had anticipated his exact maneuver. Before Hiroshi could break left, twin streams of .50 caliber fire stitched across his left wing fuel sprayed out in shimmering arcs. The cockpit filled with the bitter smell of gasoline and burnt insulation. 2 seconds. That was all it took. His controls went mushy. Hydraulic pressure collapsed. The Hayate lurched violently, rolling left toward the burning city. Hiroshi kicked the rudder, fighting to keep the aircraft level, but the left aileron was gone. He was flying a maimed bird, held aloft only by instinct and stubbornness. A voice crackled through his headset, one of his squadron mates screaming for help. Then silence. Another pilot's aircraft flashed by, trailing smoke before spiraling downward into the firestorm below. Everywhere Hiroshi looked, Japanese fighters were falling. Not one B-29 had dropped out of formation. With trembling hands, he pulled the Ki-84 away from the bomber stream, descending toward the coastline. Every gauge screamed failure. Oil temperature spiked, fuel pressure hovered near zero. His left wingtip flickered with flame. As Narimasu Airfield came into view, he realized the truth with a cold clarity that hurt more than the wounds in his side. Japan's fighters weren't simply outmatched, they were obsolete. The B-29 wasn't just better armed, it wasn't just better designed. It operated on principles of warfare Japan hadn't even begun to understand. Hiroshi managed to put the crippled Hayate down in a hard, skidding landing. Mechanics rushed forward, horrified at the state of the aircraft. 50-caliber holes riddled the fuselage. Control cables hung loose like severed tendons. He climbed out, clutching the wing for balance. 5 fighters had launched with him. Only 2 returned. And none had brought down a single superfortress. That was the moment Lieutenant Hiroshi knew the air war over Japan wasn't just being lost, it was already over. Tokyo was burning by the time Hiroshi limped back to the edge of Narimasu Airfield. The red glow on the horizon wasn't a sunset, it was a continent-sized wound. From the runway, he could see fire climbing into the night sky like a living creature, devouring entire districts with unstoppable hunger. Even from miles away, he could smell the smoke, thick and oily, drifting across the bay. While ground crews hauled his ruined Ki-84 away, Hiroshi watched more superfortress waves thunder overhead, unbothered, perfectly in formation, their turrets scanning for threats that no longer existed. Not a single Japanese fighter rose to meet them. There was nothing left to send. Radio chatter confirmed the disaster. Over 100 Japanese fighters lost in 90 minutes, nearly all destroyed by defensive fire alone. 14 B-29s were down, yet Tokyo had been turned into a furnace that killed nearly 100,000 civilians in a single night. The scale of it left Hiroshi numb. No tactic, no bravery, no last-second dive could change what he now understood with crushing clarity. This wasn't a battle. It was industrial annihilation. American technology, fuel reserves, training pipelines, and factory output had created machines Japan couldn't touch. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber, it was a moving fortress armed with a brain. Its analog computers managed defense with inhuman precision. Its turret crews protected safely inside a pressurized cockpit. Every fighter that approached was met with mathematical violence. Japan never had a chance. In the weeks that followed, Hiroshi's squadron dissolved. Replacement aircraft arrived in pieces. Pilots were pulled from training schools with only a handful of hours in the cockpit, and the few who flew died within days. New tactics emerged. Night interceptions, massed frontal charges, even ramming attacks. But none worked. The B-29's fire control system made every approach deadly. By the summer of 1945, the strategic bombing campaign had reduced 67 Japanese cities to ashes. Factories vanished. Shipping disappeared. Civilian districts became charred ruins. And through it all, B-29 formations swept across Japan with near impunity. Guided by a defensive network, generations ahead of anything the empire could build. For Hiroshi, the war ended where it had begun, in the cockpit, staring up at American formations he could no longer fight. He survived, but nearly every pilot he trained with was gone. The truth he learned on March 9, 1945, became undeniable. Japan didn't lose the sky because its pilots lacked courage. Japan lost because it was fighting a technological war with tools from another era, and against the B-29 Superfortress, brilliantly engineered, centrally coordinated, and backed by limitless American industry. Courage simply wasn't enough.